Hello, good afternoon, and warm welcome to the 176th CSH CPR Urban Workshop. This afternoon, we have Dr. Eliza T. Bertuzzo as a speaker. The title of Dr. Bertuzzo's talk is Questioning the Periurban, Everyday Existences and Possible Cohabitations in Translocalizing South Asia. And before she gives her talk, let me briefly introduce today's speaker. Dr. Eliza T. Bertuzzo holds a PhD in urban studies. She also studied comparative literature, sociology, and communication and media studies in Augsburg, Berlin, and Paris. Her research focuses on the everyday life facets of urbanization and settlement in South Asia through a feminist and decolonial lens. From her research, she also published two books, namely Fragmented Dhaka, Analyzing Everyday Life with Henry Lefebvre's Theory of Production of Space, and a recent book, Archipelago from Urbanization to Translocalization. The later book I happened to read during my PhD fieldwork, which is ethnographically so rich and theoretically so engaging. She has held various teaching and research positions. Eliza was a postdoctoral fellow at Berlin Graduate School Muslim Cultures and Societies, Free University Berlin, associate researcher at Humboldt University, senior researcher at the Future Cities Laboratory, Singapore ETH Center, and was a fellow of Indo-German Center for Sustainability, IIT Madras, Chennai. She taught in the capacities of lecturer and visiting professor. Also, she was a curator and project leader of Habitat Forum Berlin, initiating the projects Paradigmizing Karal Basti and The Driving Factor. She also ran the multimedia projects Archives of Movement, dealing with the everyday life of seasonal and circular labor migrants in Bangladesh and India. Her current research is mapping the socio-ecological infrastructures, trajectories, and transformative interactions of humans, seeds, and edible plants on the move between South Asia and Southern Europe. Currently, Eliza is an independent researcher. Eliza, you have 40 to 45 minutes for the talk, which will be followed by Q&A segment from our audience. And to the audience, the questions can be put in the chat box, and also you can raise your hands and ask questions from Eliza directly. And without any further ado, over to you, Eliza.
Thank you very much, and a warm welcome also from my side. Thanks a lot, Rama, and the entire center for facilitating very quickly this presentation and making it possible. I have felt very, very well supported. And yeah, I am currently sitting in Germany. Very excited to have the opportunity to talk here and give a little bit of a glimpse into a paper I am currently working on. Before I start, yes, yeah, I have been already a guest at the Center for Sciences Humaines in Delhi, and yeah, I hope I will be very soon, yeah, visiting again. Very honored to be the speaker of the 176th Urban Workshop. So, as I said, I am going to present from a paper I'm currently working on, and which I have envisaged as a sort of meditation on fieldwork conducted in Bangladesh and West Bengal, Kerala, and Tamil Nadu over a period of now 10 years within 3 different but yeah, subsequent but very different projects. I have to make a preliminary note on that, which regards my perspective. While trying to be aware of policy research discourses, essentially my perspective is one that mirrors a training, which you mentioned in sociology and literature studies, as well as long-term collaborations with geographers and architects. As in other work, here too, I will avail myself of the tools of mapping and ethnography and focus everyday cohabitations. But I have to say first, also as a by way of a disclaimer, that for this paper, I have chosen to mix or merge quite freely experiences from and thoughts on four South Asian cities, Dhaka, Kolkata, Kochi, and Chennai, along with their hinterlands. Um, and this is an approach that distinguishes itself substantially from how I usually proceed, which is dwelling on one more or less delimited and homogeneous site, be it a city or a territory, and allowing for historical, cultural, geographic specificities, as well as current relations, social relations, to unfold little by little through stories gathered in conversations, either deliberate interviews or random encounters with inhabitants. This choice, this kind of different strategy for the paper causes me some nervousness, but I regard it as timely and honest for a number of reasons. One, or a very important one, is the interruption of business as usual, which many researchers like me have experienced due to the COVID-19 pandemic. When a research project that I was just starting in West Bengal got canceled. So it took some time, but embracing and making this interruption an occasion to look at things from a distance, which could seem to be at odds with what anthropologists and especially ethnographers do, while waiting for the moment to come back and dive deep again, eventually seemed the best strategy. Next, at present, peri-urban areas are confronted with multiple challenges linked to the combined effect of city-centric and extractivist logics, causing and exacerbating poor planning, ecologically hazardous human interventions, as well as a characteristically fluctuating population. My intention in the paper is to connote and historically contextualize such areas, which are often defined rather by their lack of both urbanity and rurality, as indefinitely stretchable thresholds or terrain vogue. Towards that, I will be focusing the role played by augmented movement in the social process, which, speaking with Henri Lefebvre, I call production of space. A simple realization suggested this focus, namely, that in an age increasingly determined by global mobility and multilocality, for millions of working poor worldwide, everyday life and livelihoods are decided by the possibility and impossibility of being on the move. Through far-flung cooperations and infrastructures, translocal people, alike goods and ideas, trespass and reconstitute allegedly bounded administrative and geographical territories, be it temporarily and in hidden, opaque ways. I am thinking of migrant communities, especially seasonal and circular laborers, who with their movements, interactions, transactions, impact physical space. Along with others, they transform the dynamic relation between the urban and the rural, whence the relevance for studies of and planning interventions in the peri-urban. Next, valorizing inhabitants' everyday practices, forms of adaptation, adoption, and interaction, as well as their spatial perceptions, can help discover and depict these ambiguous areas, which I conceptualize as eccentric zones, as social spaces on their own right. In the second part of the presentation, after introducing you to the terminology that I have developed, people on the move and eccentric zones, I will argue that these zones both display and emerge from a specific production of space, dictated not by the urban, but by the emotional, substantiating the hypothesis of society's translocalization. Next. We are colleagues and experts, so I probably don't need to say how urban studies and development in theory and practice have been growingly occupied with the production of space outside or beyond what could be called the traditional protagonists, cities, in the past decades. And this can hardly surprise. Not only have globalization, migration, as well as the exacerbating environmental and agricultural crisis of the past 50 years pushed peripheral, suburban or peri-urban growth. In India, also the growth of secondary cities in ways that are very evident and very drastic. But there is also growing awareness of the fact that exactly these areas are and will be crucial for the livelihoods of millions of people worldwide, as well as flora and fauna. Let me briefly clarify that when I speak of the production of space, I do not have a linear, ordered, efficient, modernist production in mind, but a social process embedded in historical events, scattered, multifaceted, never unequivocal or monodirectional, and impacted by global level dynamics from policies, financial flows, and land speculation to regional politics and development measures. As much as concomitant factors on the urban and local levels, road construction, electrification, organization among inhabitants, negotiations, demographics, cultural phenomenon, gender relations, etc. Henri Lefebvre, who forged the concept of the production of space, held on the basis of his observations of urban growth in Europe and North America, that urbanization was the force determining the production of space, and a completely urbanized society was the horizon towards which the world was moving. I disagree. What makes the current debates on peri-urbanization interesting, also from a theoretical point of view, is the centrality of perspectives from ex- and decolonized countries, which challenge the historiography of Euro-American urbanization, and importantly, address the translocal entanglements connecting in unequal ways global South and global North to this day. Next. The attention given to these unequal relations resonates with the disciplines of political urban ecology and urban and rural development, concerning themselves in a more explicit way with the future of cohabitation of humans and non-humans, and more precisely the question how to change our ways of living together to prevent a complete collapse of the planet's ecological and social capacities of reproduction. As opposed to scholars for whom the growth of peri-urban spaces is a signal that urbanization has become planetary and the urban has overcome the rural. Others, in the context of India, I would mention Ananya Roy, Solomon Benjamin, have introduced concepts such as subaltern and occupancy urbanism to foreground the bottom-up, politically nuanced, everyday practices and negotiations of those who inhabit such spaces without erasing the rural, sustaining, rather, its descriptive pertinence and persistence as a policy category, administrative category, whom symbolic or cultural construct, and as a mode of production. I share these scholars' interest in inhabitation, cohabitation, cooperation, and resistance, and therefore ethnography conducted in several such spaces over the past 10 years is my starting point for the paper. The scope, however, is more than descriptive, since its occasion is a theoretical question regarding the historical process we're faced with. Next. What sort of production of space becomes manifest in contemporary peri-urban spaces? Can any hypothesis about the current historical phase traversed by the planet be uttered based on observations of peri-urban spaces? From 2012 to 2015, 10 years ago, I spent extensive fieldwork periods in Bangladesh and the Indian states of West Bengal and Kerala within a project which looked at the livelihoods of people on the move. I have to say that apart from classic migrant laborers, I deliberately included within the scope of that research other groups of mobile people, for example, daily commuters coming and going to and from cities, in this case, Kolkata and Dhaka, to sell small quantities of goods to make a living, hawkers, if you want, and often female sellers. Next slide. My approach was phenomenological and sensorial, paying as much attention to perceptions of space as to everyday survival practices, both perceptions and practices, along with everyday cooperations, struggle, and negotiations over time, produce space. So aside from traveling to and from their homes and workplaces, which could be as near as 20, 30, 40 kilometers, and as far as 2,500 kilometers in the case of the Bengali workers who commuted or migrated to Kerala in seasonal patterns, I requested many of my participants to draw mental maps like this one in order to make aspects such as territorial belonging, spatial references, orientation, and regional knowledge surface. I also recorded my movements on a GPS device, sharing the generating data with a team of cartographers and designers that assisted my research. Months later, someone had the idea to overimpose the participants' mental maps with the digitally produced cartographic representations of the journeys, revealing discrepancies and correspondences that spoke directly to how the time needed to move through spaces directly affects the perception of territories. Now, it is well known that when drawing mental maps, we generally mirror the speed of movement from A to B rather than an actual distance. However, the role of time had not been so prominent in maps drawn by inhabitants who were more or less permanently settled in Dhaka, which I had gathered in previous research for my PhD on Dhaka. Next slide, please. The map reproduced here is a good example. When I asked Badal to reconstruct the space-time of his daily commute to Kolkata, which was a 3-hour journey, started at 2 a.m., followed by 3.5 hours selling his homegrown flowers at the city's iconic flower market, and then a return journey to his village at 9:30 a.m. So I asked him to draw his daily commute, and he started by his house. His bicycle ride from Kesapat to the railway station, which is Panskura, and the railway track to Howrah station. He stressed that the ride to the station had become faster after the road in his village had been paved. And similar remarks repeated in all interviews, reflecting what I came to identify as the spatio-temporal experience of people on the move. People who, to a much higher extent than regular inhabitants, a well-tuned travel plan, an early arrival, or the ability to anticipate the end of the agricultural season could make all the difference. And people to whom a delayed monsoon, a particularly tenacious fog, or a railway strike could cause severe losses. Ecology, environmental crisis, and vulnerability to a variety of factors and variables go hand in hand, not only, but with the harshest implications for everyday survival in the global south. Please, the next slide. What this map says is relevant to my query around the non-linearity and multi-layeredness of the production of space. For millions of people on the move, territories are not only trespassable, though on unequal terms with risks, dangers, and losses, but geographic parameters such as length and distance are also highly relativized. Different qualities from those projected by economic geographers and mobility planners continually constrain and motivate people's behaviors and economic decisions, whereby chance and improvisation, contingent solutions, and the capacity to adapt to constantly fluctuating work, varying options, and income prospects predominate. Let me now turn to the spatial effects of this augmented movement for territories. Some of my journeys ended on the far outskirts of Dhaka, of which many were areas disregarded so far by corporate land speculation. Some ended in villages which could have been called remote, but were quickly transforming under intense construction activities. Please, the next slide. In West Bengal, otherwise facing recession and stagnation, I came across lively construction in agricultural districts where emigration, long endemic, has recently seen a shift from mid or even long-term migration back and forth northwestern India to circular migration towards the southern states of India. Next slide. In Kerala, I made myself familiar with Bengali construction workers who acted as the ultimate, if ancillary, and most marginal makers of the linear urbanization this state is known for. Next slide, sorry. A reflection.
You go on, Alicia, this slide that's currently on is from Kerala?
No, I forgot one slide, so I asked to move on to the next one. That is Bengal, and this is from Kerala. Pardon.
Oh, all right.
So in Kerala, I made myself familiar with Bengali construction workers who functioned as the ultimate, if ancillary, and most marginal makers of the linear urbanization this state is known for. Reflection, as in Bangladesh, of the inflow of foreign migrant remittances. Even though in many of these settlements I found occupancy, as defined by Solomon Benjamin, to play a decisive role and urban growth to be delinked from the influence or proximity of large cities, corroborating observations which have led Partha Mukhopadhyay, Marie-Hélène Zera, and Eric Denis to coin the term subaltern urbanization. Social space had features that, in my view, eluded such denominations. Something was missing, or I was looking for a link between them. Now, indeed, the disparate range of areas that I considered in that research, urban, suburban, as well as rural, point of departures, as well as arrivals of internal as well as external migration, economically marginal, depressed areas, as well as sites of urban and industrial development, decided by political and financial elites from the centers. So this wide range could seem counterproductive for any characterization, let alone categorization. Nonetheless, looking from a broader perspective, which the distance also is helpful to get, one can recognize, or I at least found, a common feature: movement. The fact that people moved between all of these areas more intensely, quickly, and pluridirectionally than ever. The next slide, please. I made sense of these settlements produced, of course, by the many and continuously evolving mechanisms of land commodification through the concept of eccentric zone. So not eccentric, but eccentric zones, where X has a spatial and a temporal meaning. In spatial terms, they overcome geographic centrality, showing that centers can always shift, whether because of fugacious booms or short-term investments here and there, or because people are decreasingly interested in or able to afford staying in one place. These zones of extensive circulations, transactions, and exchange, indeed generic, elude centrality, also in temporal historical terms. They relate to livelihoods, perhaps even whole economies, in which the scope for accumulation, concentration, has become minimal. Parallel to and related with unseen levels of enrichment, but in a very few places. For the sheer majority, the scope is more and more just making do, improvising, whence the growing importance of being on the move. In fieldwork I carried out in 2018 within a comparative project on extended urbanization, I dwelt for 3 months on the hinterlands of Kolkata. Eccentric zones in process, stretching for many kilometers around the metropolitan area and displaying extremely stark, varied, and multi-directional dynamics of land commodifications, expulsion, and movement. A common feature between my case and the cases studied by my co-investigators in the Horn of Africa, in China's Guangzhou area, in the US, Midwest, and even the North Sea, was the invisibility, qua underrepresentation of these spaces. No need to say the livelihoods of those who inhabited them were similarly underexposed and understudied. The problem of underrepresentation is to do with how urban research projects have long privileged the largest cities, sites of often violent and extraordinary concentration, and opposed it, if at all, to village life, mostly relegated to anthropologists. As a consequence, it is also difficult for inhabitants, alike environmental activists and policymakers, to attract attention to and intervene against dynamics of exclusion and utter expulsion in these areas, existing under circumstances of under legislation and under protection. Next slide, please. For Erik Swingedo and Maria Kaika, many studies have highlighted, one slide before. In between. One more. Yes. Many studies have highlighted the role of formal state institutions and actors as decision makers in, for example, decisions to locate toxic facilities, or about how non-renewable resources should be utilized. In particular, attention needs to be paid to the contradictory position between neoliberalizing growth and market-oriented politics on the one hand, and the presumed attention to questions of socio-ecological cohesion and sustainability on the other. Indeed, in the neoliberal handling of sustainability has become an imaginary fantasy, literally a utopia, they say, predicated on the possibility of socio-ecological harmony, legitimized by an equally fantastical scripting of a particular scientific nature as singular, ordered, and inherently dynamically balanced. I quote Swingerto and Kaika because at a historical moment when issues of socio-ecological inequality and environmental destruction that point to unfair and still very colonial power relations, and when they are reduced to when these issues are reduced to problems of eco-management, an urban political ecology perspective denouncing scarcity as socially produced seems commanding towards supporting bolder political demands and finding really sustainable ways of addressing the crisis. And there can be hardly any doubt that such type of research and advocacy is urgently needed for and in peri-urban areas, where the landscape is undergoing rash modifications due to overlapping urban and rural activities, where local land use and ecosystem impacts are more and more driven by global value and supply chains, and where these material issues are overlaid with social inequalities, cultural exclusion, and multi-layered political conflicts that are faced by civil society not yet or not always as well connected and organized as in the urban areas. Vis-a-vis this complexity, resistance to capitalist domination expansion and the call to reshaping cohabitation in a sustainable manner require the contributions and views, needs and aspirations, spiritual and philosophical traditions, cosmologies of all groups of inhabitants. Conciliating them might represent an insurmountable challenge for planners, for architects, for policymakers, and a no less arduous challenge for us researchers is to gather and appreciate the voices of those who, throughout history, due to many forms of domination, patriarchal, colonial, class, have been systematically excluded or left unheard. Obviously, I probably don't need to explicate it more, but the practices of women, Dalit and Adivasi, marginalized rural and urban classes, and of religious minorities, have not only survived centuries of oppression, but also informed and transformed hegemonic uses, experiences, understandings of space in the course of time, and they continue to do so. Insofar, they are all but marginal. On the other hand, these practices' reception in hegemonic discourses, including the academic discourse, is still partial and prone to many biases, misunderstandings, prejudices. Ethnographies, including film and video, soundscapes and podcasts, experimental countermappings, collaborative and performative investigations can help here, enhancing our understanding of and for the multiple effects of everyday practices on space. They can also throw light on how and why policies aiming to promote development sometimes fail, be it for ideological flaws and exaggerated confidence in techno-management, as Swingerto and Kaika argue, or for corruption, or for human-non-human interactions that we're still not properly taken into account. My next slide. My next site refers to research on the economies and livelihoods emerging in eccentric zones around Chennai, Tamil Nadu. Chennai's extensive metropolitan area and hinterlands have been contested by varied entities and marked by migration as well as an emergent cosmopolitanism for many decades now, while being also increasingly concerned by the negative consequences of neoliberal urbanization and peri-urbanization on its characteristic coastal tropical dry forest ecology. Common problems such as water scarcity and flooding have been critically analyzed by scholars in India and elsewhere as reflecting the degeneration of a century-old water management system compromised by wrong human interventions, uncontrolled real estate, and changes in the agricultural system. During the months of my fellowship at the Indo-German Center for Sustainability, IIT Madras, I started to focus possible instances of cohabitation under what seemed to be impossible circumstances. And here I will be sharing maps and a few insights and photos from two sites that I spent a lot of time in, sites of a different but related urban growth. The next, no, still here. The first is Periurban. You see a photo on the right and a map that I produced during a collective drawing session with inhabitants, with 5 female participants. Periurban is located 60 kilometers south from Chennai downtown and is a rehabilitation settlement planned by the government after the flooding of 2015, when a large number of especially urban poor were left homeless as a consequence of the destruction of the flood. And the area had already in previous years and decades accommodated a social housing for urban poor within different schemes, but often also is in a connection with flooding. And the latest development was still ongoing. Housing was still in progress of being constructed in this manner, in form of high-rise buildings or of 13, 14 floor condominiums, which left a lot of people faced with conflicts. Their jobs, their livelihoods, the school of their children were all located elsewhere and very, very far away, which created problems in dealing with higher costs for the transportation or the impossibility to arrive on time at their job, and therefore having to change employers, especially women who often work as domestic helpers. And it also left them or confronted them with the contradictions of a very, very quickly developed neighborhood, which accommodated them in rooms or small flats, but didn't provide basic services and amenities that normally would be planned for and available in other parts of the cities that are more organically grown. The other side, my next slide, please, was Nilankarai, facing the sea, also southern from downtown Chennai, but its location just parallel to the coast has in the past 20 years fostered urban sprawl, often in the form of families from middle class, upper middle class families from Chennai who decided to build their villas or houses outside of the troubled and loud main city, but also there is a lot of development for tourism and for gastronomy and other services. So there are two very different contexts of peri-urban growth. One pushed by the intervention of the state to accommodate urban poor in the consequence or in the aftermath of the flooding. And on the other hand, land that is being plotted and commodified for land speculation and housing development. In both cases, what I was looking at closely was the interaction between urban growth and especially this very, very quick process of construction that often happens with master plans, but without proper implementation of security reasons or of security measures, but also of ecological prevention. And the flora and fauna or the ecological impacts. So what happens when we don't look only at the cohabitation of dwellers, but also at the cohabitation between humans and non-humans? The next slide. This was also produced with inhabitants of Nilankarai, mainly, as I said, people who decided to build a second house and eventually also moved to that house from downtown Chennai in the range or in the course of the last 15 years. I was very interested in how the local perception of the risk of flooding was articulated by these participants. And I found that the information about the risk of flooding all along the neighborhood that or the district that was under construction was very high. Not only by experience, the experience of the most recent or the latest big flood had been in 2015. So there was memory of the flood, but there was also awareness of the fact that this neighborhood, as well as other neighborhoods in southern Chennai, were being built on former not wastelands, swamps, and retention areas, water retention areas. So the environmental impact, the fact that the construction, the cementification, and also the urban sprawl was impacting on the ecology, and therefore also the floods were increasing, was very well received and was very well present and reflected upon. There was no interview in which this topic was not mentioned. And the same thing happened also in the mapping exercises with the women in Periurban. Next slide. They are my participants who are also very active in creating awareness among the inhabitants of Periurban of their own rights to the city. And the right to the city in this case is not the right to centrality, but is the right to amenities, to having a bank, to having a nursery, to having a kindergarten, to having a health center and a clinic. It was inspiring to talk with them about a plan and actually already measures implemented to create an urban garden all along these corridors that, as you see, are not very well maintained. But they were thinking about, in collaboration with colleagues of the IGCS, creating loans on which to grow vegetables, not only in order to use them, but also to beautify or improve the look of the area and create a feeling of belonging for these families that have been basically put very quickly in these resettlement areas after a traumatic flooding. Next slide. Yeah, here I photographed an article that speaks about their activities. It was pasted on their small office. Next. Yeah, and I come to my conclusions because I see that, yeah, the time is already quite advanced, but all these aspects can be discussed further in the Q&A session. Compared to early ethnographies in classic urban and rural contexts, what made me feel uncomfortable and at times uneasy conducting fieldwork in the peri-urban seems to have to do with a speed and relentlessness of social transformations that I would relate rather than only to capital concentration and the real estate construction industry complex, or to phenomena of enclosure, soil exhaustion, and pollution, leading to agricultural crisis, to people's augmented, often desperate movement. So we know about the environmental crisis. We know about the expulsions that are produced by enclosure and privatization, but they are producing, as a reaction, a push for people to move, for more and more people to be on the move. And for an anthropologist and an ethnographer, although we are trained to follow people and also to create multi-sided ethnographies, the sense of precarity and of fluctuation, of nothing being stable, can be very, very uncomfortable to deal with, although it also creates scope for new methods and methodologies. When I speak of movement, I comprehend, aside the grown practiced mobility of inhabitants between rural-urban, urban-rural, rural-rural, rural-urban regions that can be increasingly very far apart. Also, a grown exposure to and capability of being mobile. So I'm not speaking only to the practice of movement, but also to the experience, to the incorporated and embodied experience of movement and of being on the move. So movement encompasses mobility that might be voluntary or forced, that can be related to natural disasters, climate change, or armed conflicts, that contemplates daily commuting as well as migration in its varied forms and temporalities, permanent, seasonal, circular, and that always presupposes, obviously, an infrastructure, roads, transportation hubs, telecommunications, but also people, of which certain elements are necessarily immobile, a part of the family, infrastructures, homes. There are immobile points and actors in this scenario, but people very, very much are on the move. In the places of my ethnography, augmented movement was related to a thorough change of everyday practices, and some of these practices whether they supported multi-locational livelihoods or daily commuting, were visibly transforming social space. These observations corroborate my argument that in a scenario of growing precariousness and exhaustion, the production of space is determined by something that neither the simultaneity of concentration extension in an age of planetary urbanization, nor the hypothesis of planetary suburbanization, launched to amend the latter, can satisfactorily explain. I argue that a different logic determines the production of space, and it is movement. Thinking of concentration extension through the lens of movement, we drop demographic or morphological classifications of the urban and the rural that invariably reveal and also stiffen the social processes at hand. And this can be of advantage in dealing with the diversity, genericity, and utter opacity of nowadays human settlements. It invites us to look into the conditions and circumstances of cohabitation with new eyes, instead of presupposing sedentarism and settledness as the norm. Thank you very much.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Elisa, for your talk. I really this was a fascinating talk, and we kind of, we see your approach, how socially spaces are produced, multidirectional and multitemporal movements of people and also of the researcher. And your cartographic approach is, and phenomenological approach is perhaps one of the ways how we can understand and the meaning and how space is produced socially. And also we see the mobility and immobility simultaneously, which is something we have to look who is moving and who is not. So now I open the floor for the questions from the audience and my colleagues. Yeah.
I was while you're waiting for questions from the audience, I don't see any raised hands at the moment. I think the migration story, or the mobility story rather, was fairly explicit in the Kolkata Bengal case. Could you, especially in the second Chennai case, could you sort of elaborate a little bit more on how you were thinking about it?
Yes. I'm sorry, I had to prepare this presentation very on short note, and I realized while I was preparing it that I would have needed 1 hour or a little bit more time to compose it in a more even way, or giving enough space to each of the cases. So I actually applied for the fellowship in Chennai in order to study the livelihoods of migrant laborers from Bengal in Tamil Nadu. And when I arrived, I actually started to carry out interviews with this group of people and laborers, while finding that not only construction workers but many other professions were covered by Bengalis, which made it approachable for me because I don't speak Tamil language but Bengali. So I had arrived with a different research question in mind, dealing with how migrants from another state cope and develop strategies and cooperations with other in another context, in the context of immigration, of circular migration from a state to another in India. And because of the floods, I was very much interested in the impact or in the interaction between their arrival and also their accommodation and the floods, because as often is the case, urban poor and especially urban migrant poor um, find themselves living in conditions of in areas of the city that are particularly exposed to flooding and to other ecological hazards. And in the process or during that fellowship, there were many reasons for which that research was revealed not to be feasible. Also dealing with the fact that many of these workers are Muslims, and um, uh, there was an atmosphere of fear or even suspicion when I was interviewing them as a foreigner. And so I started to change I decided to change the approach. I had it's or I actually changed the full focus of that fellowship. And so this explains a little bit that I arrived with one vision of what I wanted to do during the fellowship, and that got modified a little bit by the circumstances that I found on site. And what became very interesting was that where they worked, I mean, the construction sites where the construction workers were working, led me to these different urban sprawls areas. They were employed in the construction in Periurban, and they were employed in the construction under different contracts and in different typologies or with different types of employers in Nilankarai. And as the interviews with them revealed to be a little bit difficult or to raise suspicion among the employers and among the neighbors, I decided to engage with the inhabitants. First of all, also asking about their perceptions of migration, but then also understanding that many of them had stories of migration in themselves, either through emigration to other states of India or abroad, carrying back money, a little bit of capital in order to build a house, and then moving from downtown Chennai to another area of the city, in this case Nilankarai, which was considered to be more airy, more spacious, less polluted, and also very pleasurable view because of the closeness to the sea. Or in the case of Periurban, migration in many phases, migration from rural areas to downtown Chennai for labor reasons or upon marriage, and then another shift towards Periurban after the flood of 2015 that had produced new migration insofar as especially the women who could not afford the time and the costs of commuting every day to their former employers in downtown were starting to commute in different directions, also more south or in other areas. There is there is an industrial, a special economic zone that many of them actually had found to be a new site of employment because they were working as domestic helpers for the higher employees of the special economic zone. So, as I said, my understanding or the way I have framed movement is not only comprising classic migration, but deliberately encompasses movement of many sorts that can also be the daily commuting, because I don't conceive of movement as only the fact of migrating, but also the very fact of being dependent for survival, for livelihood, on a continuous being on the move, on decisions on strategies for survival that are very, very much demanding to be on the move. And this is not only in everyday life, but is also an understanding of, okay, now we are doing this, we are here, but next year we could move somewhere else if we have a better job, or if our children's schools change and we have a shorter commute that allows for us to make it possible for all of us to work, for both parents in the ideal case to work and the children to be closer to school. So I'm not speaking of migration in that term of labor migration in further places, but of movement as a survival strategy and as a mode of production of space, because especially in the movement, but also because the perception of one's rootedness or one's place has changed in the process, creates repercussions in how we build, in how we make agreements about housing, in how we search for housing, and in how we make negotiations and also coalitions with neighbors, which are all aspects of this social process of production of space. If we accept, or if we assume, I do assume, that the production of space is not only a task of planners, architects, and policymakers, but is an organic and very dynamic process of co-production of many, many different actors from below and from the top. Yes, I hope this was exhaustive and clear.
Elisa, I do have a couple of broader and general questions, but maybe the first question I want to ask you, you are challenging this very idea or understanding of movement, or from rural to urban, or it being unilinear, and what you're saying, it is multidirectional, right? And also you're saying this movement is for survival. People are constantly moving from one place to another for survival. But my question is, what does urban or this movement means to the people, especially given the understanding the unilinear movement from rural to urban or to a better place is also to build a better life, a promise of better life, right? And in this constant movement, what is happening, this life is getting disrupted on and off, because as you said, like if they find a better job somewhere else, a better education for their children, they'll move. But this movement is also constantly disrupting their everydayness. So my question is, what does this movement mean to these people who are on the move in your study? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think that the last years have been, for me, a continual exploration in people's possibility and capability for hoping in improvement, and also organizing for something to improve. It's not about waiting for improvement because there are better policies or better roads or better salaries. There is a wish and also a determination to self-organize, to self-produce, to improvise, and to try out. So movement is part of, or is a manifestation of, the wish to create better conditions of life for oneself and for one's family, for one's community. That is considered, and very, very often is also reflected on as a disrupting experience. There is a lot of longing in the interviews, and a lot of fear also, because movement under circumstances of poverty often implies taking risks already by the choice of your means of transportation. I have myself traveled a lot of times, necessarily with the migrants on the rooftops of trains and buses, and I know it's no joke. It's dangerous, and rituals made at departure by all the workers, male, female, young, old, whether to make a prayer or to wear a bracelet, show that the moment of departure and the commute in itself are not considered or are not taken lightly, are considered to be life-threatening, which for me is important to stress, because oftentimes we connect or we identify mobility, or we connote mobility very positively, as always promising an improvement and a rising. But it is not often so, or if it is so, it also contains the other side. For the urban, I mean, I think that a lot of Western European urban theory and urban studies have tended in the last 50 years to identify the urban with emancipation, difference, with organizing and therefore also resisting, which is the case. We have many cases that prove it, and in India also plenty of them. But on the other hand, I think that kind of resistance and will to create, to collaborate, to survive, but not only to survive, to live well, is not something that is sparked in urban areas only. So already the movement to the city, trying for that kind of or trying to go for that option, for that better life, is also showing that it's not a peculiarity or privilege of the urban to aspire. It's a necessity and a condition that all inhabitants share. But what happens is that already the census of 2011 showed that the megacities are decreasing in population, and this is because the conditions of life, the cost of living in these cities is very high, even if you choose to live in a self-organized settlement or in a bosty. And many of my interview partners had been urban dwellers, had lived in cities, and then decided to move back to the village or to the peri-urban because of the cost of living in the central city, and had decided that movement was, in spite of the disadvantages, of the discomfort, also of the risk and the time, the more viable strategy for them. And so when urban life becomes very, very exclusionary and very, very much produces expulsion, movement becomes the coping mechanism with that. And I guess that was the title of my book, from urbanization to translocalization, that this impacts also on understandings, but also practices of urbanization, of urban growth, and possibly also urban planning. How do we conceive of urban regions where the urban is not necessarily emancipatory, where capitalist commodification has reached has reached not only very, very high levels, but has also pushed the capacities of reproduction, social reproduction, ecological reproduction, to a limit. so much so that new expulsions and new evictions are the consequence, and new movement arises. So I have a feeling, or a sense from my fieldwork, that not the urban is the force that actually produces space, but the motional, so the movement does it, and therefore I spoke about translocalization.
How you want to come in?
Hi, yes, I have now got a bit of cold. I hope you can hear me. Thank you,
Yes,
Elisa.
hello.
Very fascinating talk. I have two questions. One is that the peri-urban space is not so well defined, it doesn't have boundaries, it's very porous, people move in and out, activities move in and out. In this case, both Chennai, Kolkata, and Dhaka have very large metropolitan areas, very, very large. And Trivandrum has much smaller metropolitan area. So in this case, how did you define peri-urban? Where did how did you sort of put a boundary to it? It's first question. Second
In
question,
Kerala, sorry, pardon.
would you like to
Go
answer
ahead.
this question?
No, go ahead.
The second one is more simple.
Mhm.
I think peri-urban development is not only driven by people, lower income communities who are dislocated, displaced, don't have access to land, so they keep moving out and out and out to find space where they can live, even if it increases their commuting time and cost. But there is also peri-urbanization, largely because real estate developers pushed development in the peri-urban areas. And you have opted not to talk about it. And why is that?
Well, maybe because I was a little bit rushing. So first question, Trivandrum. I have spent 1 month in Trivandrum in 2022, but most of my fieldwork in Kerala has been centered around Kochi, Ernakulam.
Okay.
So the map in the presentation, the map that showed my sites, my fieldwork sites, was the map of Ernakulam. And in that case, you again have a very large urban area, urban metropolitan area that, so to say, justifies speaking about the peri-urban and also of a very large expansion around, or starting from and going outside in an eccentric way from the city. But at the same time, I feel that it's not a question, or I find it important to delink the administrative definition of a metropolitan area with its core and with its development or catchment area from the peri-urban. I guess it didn't probably transpire from the presentation, but how I see the peri-urban is that in its merging urban and rural, it actually trespasses those boundaries, those administrative boundaries. You can find the peri-urban outside of the metropolitan area of Dhaka. And in so far, I don't conceive of the peri-urban as something that is delimited by a boundary, but something that actually really escapes boundaries, because it is rather a process of hybridization and of transformation that has many actors and many factors. No, for Chennai, I rushed a little bit, so probably it didn't come through. But the second case study, Neelankarai, is very much corresponding to what you say, land commodification, and the fact that urban sprawl is very much pushed not only by movement, by migration, by people who have to find for accommodation and jobs and venues for their everyday life and survival outside of the city center or very far from it, but also by real estate development. So I don't know if you are familiar with Chennai, but Neelankarai is one of the recent urban extensions of the city. I mean, 30 years. And in the last 15 years, the first wave of those who started to build a second house, which eventually they moved to live there permanently, has, I mean, apart from that, like that first wave was followed by very this deliberate and very powerful investment that is not only for individual housing, but that actually aims at creating gated communities, not with condominiums, but with villas, and then tourist villages, resorts, and a golf club, and so on and so on. So that is all private land development that is done with within master plans. I mean, it's not done without control, without state intervention and authority, but it's also having repercussions that are really very opaque and very difficult to foresee. Plus, also ecologically very problematic.
Okay, you have answered my question, but somehow irrespective of official boundaries, when you are trying, or each one of us is trying to identify peri-urban areas, what are how do you say peri-urban ends here and rural begins here? Are there 3 or 4 parameters that come to your mind?
I dare try, but I have not thought about it until now. Since this is a paper that is in progress, I will probably use this question in order to develop it further, and I thank you a lot for that. I gut feeling, I would say that no, I would start from the other way around. There is rural in the urban, and there is urban in the rural.
Yes.
So that is one thing. So already that definition of rurality and urbanity is actually exposed to or requires some rethinking, because we need to categorize, we need also those administrative boundaries in order for planning and many other services or many other functions to be possible. But already these two definitions that derive from a very modernist understanding of settlement present certain discrepancies and also certain contradictions in everyday life, but also in the practice of planning, I guess. Having said that, from the perspective of movement, which is the one that I am taking here and that I am trying to train myself to think through, the fact that large areas, large regions, or even states, different states, cities in different states, are considered to be in a continuum that is not linear, but from which one can choose. Now I live in the countryside because there is a harvest and I have for some months a good possibility to earn some money. But in the dry season, I work as a construction worker in Tamil Nadu because it gives me a lot of or a higher salary. Then I move on. And if the construction boom in Tamil Nadu should end, I will go for another city. So from that perspective, that is one of very, very ad hoc and short term or only mid-term projection about one's possibilities. The peri-urban becomes actually encompassing. Movement creates spaces that are more hybrid and eccentric zones. What I spoke of these eccentric zones are basically reproducing themselves due to those movements and due to land speculation, commodification, and so on. So if I have to say one parameter, I would say hybridization, very, very strong hybridization, the confluence of rural and urban modes of production also. I mean, thinking of sites, I have sites in mind both in the peri-urban of Kolkata and Dhaka, where agriculture is still practiced because land commodification, land development has not yet arrived, and also because the land is very low, so it resists the urban growth, and also because the communities that are rooted there are fighting to stay put. So it's not that the entire population is on the move. There is also a population that is very stable and creates certain circumstances that that resist the urbanization. But at the same time, you have urbanization in villages or in peri-urban areas, often catalyzed or enabled through remittances, through not only through land developers, or very often not because of some very big developers, but because migrants send remittances home. And then you have densification, you have more taxes because when they come back, they start to have a shop, and there is a little bit more revenue, and the census town in that case start to sprawl and to have an urban growth with higher buildings and so on, which again impact on the planning because you have different regulations about the height of houses and the width of the roads. So it's a process, and I think that the most salient feature would be if a very ephemeral, a very, very precarious built fabric. And for sure a hybrid, I would say hybridity, not only of the physical space and of the environment, but also of the practices, of the ways that people make do. Good. As I say, so, the combination. So tentatively, these two.
Yeah, good.
And then I will
you can build on it in your paper.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Right. There is, shall I pull that up? There's one question which was sent. Can you read from there? It's okay, I think I'll.
Okay.
So,
I can't hear.
If you're looking at, Mahala is asking the question as to, you have Kerala and you have West Bengal, and then you also have as you said, Bangladesh, and the rural-urban continuum and the relationship, as well as the landscape that we saw from your photographs, that seems quite varied. So, could you sort of reflect on how the relationship that you see between the kind of mobilities in these three places, in Dhaka, in Kolkata, and in Chennai, Trivandrum, Kochi, Ernakulam, that area. How do you see that? I mean, if you were to see sort of similarities and differences broadly, how would you sort of see them?
I'm not sure I understood the question because I was still taking a note.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Basically looking at, if you look at the mobility and relationship of mobility and the periurban in Dhaka, in Chennai, in Kolkata, and in Kerala, because the nature of the continuum and the landscape is different, how do you sort of see how does the relationship change with the nature of the landscape in some sense? If you were
Thank
to
you. Yes,
reflect a little.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you. So I started, or I mean, I have been doing research in the flatlands in the Delta region of Bengal, of West Bengal and Bangladesh for many years, and historically, not only in the contemporary time, but even in British time, the topology that is very flat and allows for commuting, for communication very easily, has been one of the factors that urban historians have also mentioned as one of the factors for urban development, for a very early urbanization in that part of the subcontinent. The fact that the rivers were also used as communicating, as axis of communication and for the transportation of goods, also playing a role in that. That topology very substantially differs from the topology that you find in Kerala with the Ghats and a slope or a gradient from mountains to the coast in a very, very delimited space or territory. And also in Tamil Nadu, that not only has a different climate, but also different soil, is much drier and has a hinterland that is very, very, very different from the region, from the delta. So the environmental or ecological conditions, environmental, I mean, this topology, the rivers, the communications, but also the ecology. And when we think of the monsoons, you have 2 monsoons in Tamil Nadu, they mean a lot for people on the move as well. In Bengal, you have 1 monsoon and 3 harvests. So all these environmental and ecological features have historically, not only now with the climate change in a fast way, they are also changing, but they have historically constrained as well as facilitated movement and urbanization in the areas. And from that point of view, I think I have no ambition to draft an encompassing description of translocalization everywhere, following the same modalities or having the same dynamics. in every environment, in every climate zone, in every topology, you will have different forms of movement. And what is interesting for me is that in all sites, land speculation and commodification is creating ecological distress, environmental damages that push people further away or more people away to search for other venues to make a living. Part in Bengal, in the Delta region, the risk of flooding is higher, but there is also a lot of privatization of land for tourists and fisheries. So communities that more or less could make a living are finding themselves constrained in the possibility, for example, of fishing for their families or for the local market in their home places. This also corroborates migration. And so there is a concomitance of factors like privatization, enclosure, and land speculation that create the need for more movement. And so we don't have only, it's not only climate migration, it's very much in that sense, in a political ecology understanding, it's a Capitalocene migration. It's migration that is caused not only or not simply in the aftermath by climate change or environmental distress, but by extreme extraction and exhaustion of the ecology that pushes in a form and in an intensity that we have not seen before movement in polycentric or eccentric directions. And I would need a longer time and many more maps, which I avail of, but I didn't use in this presentation to make a proper comparison of the geographies. But I think, yeah, it is something that I should probably work on in a further paper.
Just a quick thought that occurred while you were speaking, and especially with respect to one difference that I see, and since you mentioned transport at the beginning in responding to Pushpa's question, both Chennai and Kolkata have these suburban railway networks. You mentioned the Pashkura and the person coming in from Pashkura during a presentation. Dhaka and Kerala, to the best of my knowledge, don't. Do you see that as somehow affecting the manner in which you conceptualize the issue?
Yes. Well, it does impact the way that people have to, I mean, the choices that people have to travel and the costs, above all, that the people have to travel. I mean, to just make a very, basic example, my fieldwork in Bengal, in West Bengal, and in Bangladesh was in both states 5 months and 5 months when I was following the migrants. In Bangladesh, the Bangladeshi taka compares to 100 taka compared to €1, and at the time, 1 Indian rupee or 80 Indian rupee compared to €1. So the currency was weaker in Bangladesh. So my advantage coming from Europe with a grant from Europe was bigger. I had an advantage economically speaking in Bangladesh, but my costs for the commutes over 5 months in both states were much higher, were 30% higher, actually 35%, I calculated that, in Bangladesh than in West Bengal. And this shows that when you already have extreme poverty and expulsion, pushing people in order to find a survival, to move, the costs that they have to face in order to do that when there is no public transport are extremely much higher, and therefore their disadvantage is much bigger. So for sure, the difference in that availability or not availability of a suburban transport system is impacting on the way that movement happens, and also the benefits that one can draw from it, because there is a higher loss in terms of money where there isn't. And therefore, I would say that for my conceptualization of translocalization, it has led me to stress a lot that that which planners know, that public transport must be universal, and that planning must really be pushed and be given the funds in order to implement those facilities for public transport. And it is not only a question of easing movement or easing mobility for the white collar jobs. It means really a difference that I mean, for urban poor, for working poor, in the rural and in the urban and in the peri-urban, can really mean a lot. And for me, speaking of translocalization instead of urbanization already points towards that. It means to actually say our planning, our understanding of settlements needs to change from giving priority to sedentariness and to permanence, to trying to conceive and develop other models of cohabitation that integrate the need of movement. And that is probably much more than planning a better suburban transport system on the railway. It means also integrating the transport, the means of transport, integrating the networks, and even thinking about housing, accommodation in different ways that can be also vary in time. So if we really would take it seriously, it would actually include or set or facilitate and foster a thorough thinking of how we plan, which is not only for settlements that are enclosed, but which is for people who are moving and for things that need to move and circulate, which is already something that is done very much, but always in the framework of a neoliberal understanding of easing the transportation of goods for their better delivery, and in that sense is not something that contributes to better cohabitation and more equal cohabitation. Because when I say better cohabitation, I'm not speaking about a more comfortable way of living. I'm speaking of a more equitable way of living and commuting that we're far from in the global north and in the global south.
Does anybody else have questions? We have If not, we can. Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Alyssa. Okay, I think we have very little time. I'll just ask one more question, and I'm asking this question since your work is on the movement and your current research is also looking at socio-ecological infrastructures, right? Since you've been talking about this movement and you're also talking about the urban infrastructure, my question is how these movement kind of affect the ecology or environment of or urban environment, in the sense where we are also concerned about the environment, but urban development and the movement, okay, it is also happening at great ecological damages. At the same time, there's an urban urge of aesthetics, of beautification, where we also want parks and all sorts of things. So I just want to kind of understand how this movement affect or what it brings for the environment as such or ecologically. I hope I made my question clear. Okay, thank you.
It would be interesting to hear the opinions of planners and environmentalists or urban ecologists here, because I don't have numbers at hand. Having said that, the type of movement that I am interested in is augmenting or is increasing and becoming a phenomenon that regards many more people, is to do with processes of expulsion, of exhaustion, of extraction that have damaged the ecology. So this has to be very clear. I mean, there is nothing more damaging than those logics and ways of production. So when inhabitants need to move because entire territories have become unproductive or are contaminated, or the water is contaminated with arsenium, you see that the question of damage, ecological damage deriving from movement, is of a secondary importance. Nonetheless, for cities and also for regions, when more people are on the move, there are issues of waste management, of transport, that causes pollution, because most of our means of transport are run by petrol. It creates also the problem of waste, of not only the waste management, but also canalization. I mean, there is more request for certain amenities, including also sanitation, in different points of time that can fluctuate. There can be more population in a certain period of time and less population, less demand in others, which creates probably a nightmare for those who are tasked with the planning and maintenance of the infrastructures. But I don't think that this is a reason to claim that augmented movement or this translocalization is unecological or is a threat for ecology. Because the threat that we need to very, very, very carefully, very, very critically address derives from extraction that is unchallenged, derives from polluting industries that are continuously fined, are continuously banned, are continuously controlled, but continue also to happen. And therefore, I think that before we even start, or in parallel to starting to think about ecological means of transportation, ecological ways of waste management, ecological sanitation, or ways that also create a circularity in those processes. We need to also tackle those things at the very back, because there is no beautification. I mean, obviously, each inhabitant of urban areas and rural wishes to live in an environment that is not only safe and healthy but pleasurable. But it becomes very much a task of aesthetic surgery. And I am quite sure that it is very short-lived, because the experience in Chennai for me was particularly clear, because there is a social welfare state that works much better than in many other cities of India and Bangladesh that I know. And there is also a pro-poor approach to urban planning, but at the same time, there is the wish to free those areas of the inner city that appeal to the upper middle class and that are being transformed in parks, but were originally the areas in which the urban poor who now have to live in Periurban lived. And this creates a very contradictory scenario in which, in order to make the city beautiful, you have to evict the people who work for the city. But at the same time, you have not at all tackled the question of the flooding, because Chennai can beautify itself, but when the flood comes, it destroys again, and there are not real solutions to the reasons or to the causes of those floods, which are not only climate change disasters, are human-made disasters. Yeah.
Thank you.
Ask you to sort of conclude, Lisa. How do you see your work, if you were to sort of look at it? How do you see it sort of challenging the existing conceptions of the peri-urban as you see it in the literature? I mean, what would you say would be the key sort of places where you would see a difference with the existing literature?
Thank you. Yeah, I question it because in one way, I think it is important to move away from definitions of the peri-urban as only that which is between the rural and urban, both in terms of its boundaries and in terms of its qualities, but also contesting in the sense that because of a long tradition of city centricity, what lies outside of the city has often been looked down at. And we are used to read about the underserviced peri-urban areas or the greenfield developments and so on, which all actually convey an understanding of substandard living or substandard urbanity with no centrality. And by questioning the peri-urban that I chose for my title, I didn't want basically only to start a reflection about, okay, what is really the peri-urban? Is it really something that is only in between, or is it not something that is actually showing the contemporary features and agents of production of space? But also I wish to move in the direction of acknowledging that that if we accept movement and we accept the peri-urban as the environment that grows from that augmented movement in the contemporary age, the capital scene, we need to take it much more seriously. And so not only seeing it as underserviced or substandard and lacking, but we have to really reformulate our understandings of what peri-urban territories or peri-urban fabric and peri-urban living are and can be. Because, as I said in opening the lecture, it is not by a surprising thing that many scholars have started to study exactly these areas, because they are critical sites and they are also the environments or the areas where millions of people are living, and they are the ones where the population is really growing. So it's crucial to redefine them in a way that is not city-centric.
Thank you so very much.
Actually, like now I'm thinking, I am actually contesting the city-centric understanding of the peri-urban.
Sure.
I can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you so very much, Elisa, for your fascinating and engaging talk. And now we don't have any more questions, so we just finally say thank you so very much for accepting our invite and having delivered this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation, and I wish you a very pleasant evening in Delhi and elsewhere. Thanks so much for the platform.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.